Having now captured Delhi, Lake's next objective was to capture the city of Agra. Agra is located on the west bank of the river Jamuna, over 100 miles or 170 kilometers southeast of Delhi. This city was a very important center for Scindia's military. It had a strong fortress, which could house a large garrison, and it was also a major weapons production center. And besides that, the control over the city would also help the British secure the west bank of the river Jamuna. And control over that river would help the British further in establishing their control over the Doab as a whole. So the conquest of Hindustan would really not be complete without the capture of this place. Lake's army left Delhi on the 23rd of September 1803, and they moved along the west bank of the river Jamuna towards Agra. As I mentioned before, Lake had captured a lot of guns from the Mahrattas in the Battle of Delhi, and he planned to use some of them in the siege of the fort of Agra. But instead of having his army carry those guns over land, he decided to use the river Jamuna to transport them to Agra by boat. On the way to Agra, on the west bank of the Jamuna, there is the town of Mathura. Mathura is considered to be a holy place in Hinduism, as it is the birthplace of the god Krishna. But this place was not just a religious center. It was also one of the major cannon foundries of Scindia's army, which means that many of the guns that blew the British soldiers to shreds throughout this war were made here. So there's no denying that Mathura was a very important place. And yet Scindia made no effort to defend it. There was no resistance at Mathura. The British could just march right in. But Lake's army was not the first among the British troops to arrive at Mathura. That honor belongs to the brigade of Lieutenant Colonel Vandeleur. So, to recap, after a force of Maratha cavalry on the Monsieur Fleury had attacked Shikohabad in the beginning of September, a brigade of cavalry under Colonel Macon was sent in pursuit of them. And eventually, this brigade fell under the command of Vandeleur. They continued to operate in the area against the Maratha horse, who were using scorched earth tactics. Anyway, the brigade of Colonel Vandeleur eventually arrived at Mathura on the 30th of September, 2 days before Lake did. And Vandeleur was also the one to oversee the surrender of Dudrenec from Scindia's army. More than 2 months earlier, on the 17th of July, Dudrenec had been sent from the Deccan with some battalions of Scindia's regular infantry to reinforce Peron in Hindustan. And they finally arrived there by the beginning of October. But I guess Dudrenec wasn't really feeling it. Because after arriving there, he immediately went to Mathura and surrendered to Vandeleur on the 1st of October. Along with him were two other European officers named Smith and Larpent. But even though Dudrenec surrendered, his battalions refused to go with him, and they continued to be at war with the British. Their command was now taken over by Ambatje Ingle, who had been sent from the Deccan, along with Dudrenec's army, in order to take over the Viceroyalty of North India from Peron. This Ambatje Ingle was one of the most powerful Maratha Sardars at Scindia's court, and he was an opportunist whose ultimate goal was to create an independent state of his own. Not really that different from what the Scindia family had done decades earlier. Lake arrived at the town of Mathura on the 2nd of October, and here he had a chance to interview Dudrenec, who gave him a lot of information about the battalions that he had just led. He gave him data about his men, his pieces of artillery, and about his logistical arrangements. But he of course could not say much about what his battalions were up to after he had abandoned them, about their current movements and their location. In other words, Dudrenec was able to provide the British with strategic intelligence, but not with tactical intelligence. The latter was, in general, a weak point for the British throughout this war. While he was at Mathura, Lake allowed some of his Hindu sepoys to go into the town and perform religious purification rites in the Jamuna River. Agra, being a former capital of the Mughal Empire, was home to many monuments that were built during that time. The most famous of which, by far, is the Taj Mahal. Another major monument here is the Agra Fort, which at one point used to be the main residence of the Mughal emperors, before the capital was shifted to Delhi. This fort is made out of red sandstone, which is why it's also known as the Lal Killa, or Red Fort. But that might be a bit confusing, because the Red Fort in Delhi is also known by that name. Originally, the Maratha garrison of Agra was commanded by two European officers, namely George Hessing and Hugh Sutherland. But the year 1803 was a chaotic period for Scindia's army, during which their command and control completely broke down. As we all know, many of Scindia's European mercenary officers were defecting to the British, and the remainder was often suspected, and not without reason, of wanting to defect as well. So, to prevent that from happening, some European officers were confined by their subordinate Maratha Sardars. We've seen this happen at the fort of Aligarh, where the European commander, Pedron, was arrested by a certain Bali Rao, who then took over the command of the fort and continued the resistance against the British. In the fort of Agra, something similar happened. The Maratha garrison suspected their European commanders, Hessing and Sutherland, of wanting to surrender to the British. And so they confined them. But unlike at Aligarh, where Balirao took over the command, at Agra there was no single leader that was able to take over. So the garrison was now divided. In addition to the fort's garrison, there were also 7 battalions of Scindia's army right outside the fort of Agra. 5 of those 7 battalions belonged to the 5th Brigade, led by Major Brownrigg, which had earlier been sent north by Scindia to defend Hindustan. They arrived too late to participate in the Battle of Delhi, and so they went to Agra instead. But here they were viewed with distrust by the local garrison, who did not allow them inside the fort. This was in part because some of them suspected that these battalions might have already gone over to the British. But most importantly, it was because there was a large treasure inside the fort, and the garrison did not want to share it. So yeah, these 7 battalions had no choice but to take post outside the fort walls. And they now occupied the town and the glacis. So the British arrived at Agra on the 4th of October. The next day, they marched past the main part of the city and took up a position further east. This was because Lake wanted to attack the eastern approach of the fort. Lake's first task was to isolate the Mahrattas at Agra and cut off their logistical lines. And he did this by surrounding the city with his cavalry. He was also helped in this by Ranjit Singh, the Jat Raja of Bharatpur, who, as part of a treaty with the British, had sent 5,000 horsemen to Agra to help complete the blockade. So, with the help of the Jats, the British were able to completely surround and isolate the city by the 8th of October. But Lake was not able to lay siege to the fort just yet. He first had to deal with those 7 Maratha battalions standing outside the fort walls. These battalions occupied both the town of Agra as well as the glacis of the fort, and they had 26 guns with them. Lake's plan was to attack the Mahrattas from 2 sides at the same time. There was going to be an attack from the west, directed against the Mahrattas inside the town, and there was going to be an attack from the east, directed against the Mahrattas on the glacis before the fort. The attack from the west was to be carried out by the brigade of Brigadier General Clark. This brigade consisted of the 2nd Battalion of the 9th Regiment and the 1st Battalion of the 12th Regiment of the Bengal Native Infantry, as well as 5 companies of the 16th Regiment of the Bengal Native Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel White. There were no European regiments in this brigade. Their task was to enter the town and take out a large body of Maratha infantry that was lodged inside a large mosque called the Jama Masjid. This mosque is located inside the town, just to the west of the fort. It had very strong walls, which were able to withstand artillery fire. And so it made sense that the Mahrattas were occupying this place, especially since they weren't allowed inside the fort. So, sometime before the attack, and in preparation to it, this brigade moved back west and took up a position somewhere to the rear of the town of Agra. Meanwhile, the bulk of Lake's army remained in their camp in the east. And from there, another force was sent forward to launch an attack on the south side of the fort. This force consisted of the 1st Battalion of the 14th and the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 15th Native Infantry. And they were led by Lieutenant Colonel McCulloch, Major Haldane, and Captain Worsley. Their first task was to clear the ravines surrounding the south and southwest faces of the fort, which were occupied by Mahratta sharpshooters. Then, after that, they were to attack the Mahrattas on the glacis and take out the 26 Mahratta guns that were posted there in a battery outside the fort walls. Besides these two attacks that were carried out by Lake's infantry, Lake also planned to deploy a force of cavalry in the area near the Taj Mahal in order to cut off a major escape route for the Mahratta fugitives. It was only after these tasks were completed that Lake's army could begin the siege operations. The attack was scheduled to take place in the morning of the 10th of October, and it went as follows. So, in the west, Clark's brigade was to attack the town. It was split into two columns. One column was led by Colonel White, and the other by Clark himself. These columns were to move into the town of Agra by separate routes, and they were to attack the Jama Masjid from two sides in a pincer movement. At least that was the plan. But when these troops moved into the town, things got a little hectic. As the day wore on, Lake's main force in the east could see smoke rising from the city, and they were also hearing loud musket fire. So it is clear that Clark's brigade had run into some fierce opposition. But we don't know exactly what happened, because the accounts are confused. It seems that Brigadier Clark's first column, which was led by himself, had gotten lost somewhere inside the city. And at the same time, they were also being fired upon by Mahratta muskets from the windows and the rooftops. The second column, under Colonel White, was doing a little better, at least at first. And unlike the first column, they actually were able to find their target. But unfortunately, they too ran into some unexpectedly strong opposition. And because they were at risk of running out of ammunition, they were eventually forced into a holding action, somewhere close to the walls of the fort. Meanwhile, the first column suffered an unacceptable number of casualties, and they were unable to go any further. So Clark ordered them to retreat. He also tried to locate the other column of Colonel White, so that he could give him the order to retreat as well. Eventually, one of Clark's runners was able to find the column, and he gave the orders in question to Colonel White. But the latter refused to follow them. Apparently, White thought that it would be disgraceful for his troops to retreat, and he refused to abandon his position so long as he still had a single officer left alive under him. Colonel White proceeded to send a letter under fire to General Lake, in which he stated what had happened. Lake responded to White and paid him a handsome compliment in orders, but he ordered Brigadier Clark to return immediately to camp. So ultimately, the column of Colonel White did not leave their position near the fort walls. And after Clark had reinforced him with one of his own battalions, White was finally able to secure a foothold and consolidate his position there. So, to sum up, the western attack on the town of Agra turned out to be a failure for the most part. The attack on the Jama Masjid had failed, and the Maratha infantry were still in control of that mosque. But the column of Colonel White was able to gain a position near the fort walls. So that's at least something. Meanwhile, in the east, Lake's main force was tasked with attacking the Maratha infantry on the south side of the fort. But to get there, they first had to clear the ravines along the way, as these were the hiding places of the Maratha sharpshooters. These sharpshooters were very effective, because unlike the average Maratha infantrymen, who were armed with flintlocks, the Maratha sharpshooters used long-barreled matchlocks, which were much more accurate. So the Maratha sharpshooters were posted in the ravines to the south of the fort of Agra, and the British first had to clear those ravines before they could move on. The Mahrattas basically used these ravines just like trenches. They were used as a place of shelter from where they could fire against the enemy. But one major difference between these natural ravines and regular man-made trenches is that these ravines were a lot harder to spot. Because what happens when you dig a trench is that the sand gets overturned and it will have a different color compared to the sand in the surrounding area, which has been lying there for a while. And a man-made trench will also have a distinct berm next to it, which a natural ravine does not have. So basically, you can see that people have been digging there. None of that was the case for ravines, as these are made by nature and they have been there for quite a while. This meant that they were very well camouflaged, as they were basically just slits in the ground with indistinct edges. So these ravines were the perfect place for sharpshooters to hide inside and from where to fire against their enemy. And the enemy, in the meantime, would have a difficult time trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. So, for the British, clearing these ravines near Agra was going to be an absolute nightmare. So yeah, when the British marched through the area, the Maratha sharpshooters shot at them from the ravines. And they inflicted a lot of casualties, while suffering very few casualties themselves. It was difficult, but eventually the British were able to get a large number of their men across the ravines. And they now thought that they had enough men with them to begin on their next task. Their objective now was to take out the 26 Mahratta guns, which were posted on the glacis outside the fort walls in a well-fortified support battery. It was a little bit strange that these guns were posted outside the fort walls rather than on them, right? But either way, they were very dangerous and they needed to be taken out. The British were a bit impatient and they did not want to wait for the rest of their men to come up. So they quickly got together and they advanced to their target in broken formation. Meanwhile, the Mahrattas were waiting for them in ambush. They lay nestled among the rocks, completely silent, and with their muskets ready. And when the British got close, they suddenly opened fire. So, as a result, this British advance party suffered a lot of casualties. And as they were isolated from the rest of Lake's army, they were now in danger of being completely destroyed. Luckily, Major General St. John saw what was happening, and he, at the head of the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Native Infantry, now advanced to their support. So, after the Mahrattas had delivered their volley of musket fire, they ran back for safety towards the glacis. Or at least, that's what it looked like. The British thought that they were now finally winning, and they ran forward to pursue them, not realizing that they were being led into yet another trap. So far, the British did not really have to worry much about the Maratha artillery mounted on the fort walls, because they were well below their range. And apparently these guns could not be lowered to hit targets that were closer nearby. But now, as they moved towards the glacis, the British were being lured into an area where they were well within the range of the flintlocks of the Mahratta infantry, who were standing on the fort walls, right above the glacis. So, yet again, the British suffered a lot of casualties due to their own recklessness. There was heavy fighting near the glacis and in the defensive outworks of the fort. But as the British advance party continued to be reinforced by troops from further in the rear, they were able to keep up the fight. And in the end, they managed to drive the Mahrattas away from the glacis and into the outworks of the fort. Ultimately, the British attack was for the most part a success. They were not only able to capture all of the 26 Maratha guns that were posted outside the fort, but also their field carriages and limbers, as well as 29 ammunition carriages. That being said, they were not able to completely eliminate the Maratha infantry outside the fort, as there were still 3 battalions of them in and around the outworks. In the end, the British had lost 228 men, including both killed and wounded. The Mahrattas had lost about 600 men. So, to sum up, the Battle of Agra was only a partial success for the British. In the east, they were able to drive the Mahrattas away from the ravines and from the glacis, but they could not dislodge them from the outworks of the fort. In the west, the British failed to capture the Jama Masjid, although Colonel White was able to secure a foothold near the walls of the fort. But what the British could not take by force, they were instead able to buy with money. After the battle, the 3 Maratha battalions that were in and around the outworks started negotiating with the British. And within 2 days, they surrendered. After which, they entered the service of the East India Company. Another 2 days after that, on the 14th of October, the Maratha troops in the Jama Masjid similarly surrendered to Colonel White, also on condition of being employed in the East India Company, with the same pay as they received previously from Scindia. And their officers were also to continue with them, with the same rank as they held before. The accounts of the British use the word surrender here. But, as Randolph Cooper pointed out, that's not exactly accurate, because it implies that they were defeated, and that's not how these Mahrattas would have seen it. These battalions consisted of sepoys, who were basically just mercenaries. This meant that they were not inherently tied to Scindia. They just fought for the highest bidder. And if the British were willing to provide them with the same pay, it was not really a loss to them. Especially when it comes to the fighting in the west, in the town of Agra, I really wouldn't say that the Mahrattas were defeated, as they had successfully defended the Jama Masjid from the British. It was only after those sepoys had entered into the service of the East India Company that Colonel White and his men were able to take possession of that mosque. So basically, the only person who really lost here, other than the people who died, of course, was Scindia. So, with the town of the Glacis now secure, the British were finally able to begin laying siege to the fort. And they still had a lot of work to do, as they now had to build a grand siege battery. Normally, when building a siege battery, it is often necessary to dig trenches, which allows people to travel to and from the construction site without getting shot at from the fort walls. And of course, digging those trenches is a lot of work. But luckily, there were a lot of ravines near the fort of Agra, which the British could now use as natural trenches, instead of having to dig them themselves. So this reduced a lot of the workload. It's a little bit ironic, because those same ravines that used to shelter the Maratha sharpshooters, who had inflicted so many casualties among the British troops, were now being used to protect the British from the sharpshooters on the fort. So the British used these ravines to bring supplies to the grand battery that they were building. And while they were walking through them, they always had to keep their heads down to avoid getting shot. The British had to work under terrible conditions. The weather was hot and the troops were dehydrated. Besides that, there were a lot of Maratha dead around the ravines, which were still left unburied. And their bodies now began to decompose, which left a terrible stench. And there were swarms of flies everywhere, which was really annoying. The British also built another secondary battery 350 yards southeast of the fort, near the river. The British were making a lot of progress within a fairly short time, and the Maratha garrison inside the fort began to worry. They finally decided to negotiate for a possible surrender. And interestingly, they used their two European officers, Hugh Sutherland and George Hessing, as their intermediaries. This was a little odd, because those same two officers had previously been ousted by the garrison in a coup, after which they were placed under house arrest. But now the garrison was asking them to negotiate with the British on their behalf. Anyway, Sutherland and Hessing gave the garrison the advice to surrender. This was because they believed that if they continued to resist, and Lake had to take the fort by force, then he wouldn't leave any one of them alive. And they had good reason to believe this, as that was exactly the fate suffered by the garrison of Aligarh. So anyway, Captain Salkeld from Lake's army entered the fort to continue the negotiations on behalf of the British. Unfortunately for him though, the negotiations didn't go very far, as the opinions differed within the Maratha garrison. There was a large part of the garrison that had lost all hope of victory, and who were willing to surrender. But there were also some more zealous Maratha Sardars who were determined to continue the fight, no matter what. One major problem was that, after they had ousted Sutherland and Hessing, they couldn't find a successor to take their place. So there was no single leader unifying the garrison. So, long story short, they couldn't come to an agreement. And as the fighting had broken out again between the British and the Mahrattas, Captain Salkeld finally left the fort at about 8 o'clock in the evening. Due to the siege, the moat surrounding the fort was now fully flooded, and so the only way to get in and out of the fort at the time was by water. So Captain Salkeld had to take a boat to move from the fort to the river. And he also took a light with him to see where he was going. Anyway, one of the British batteries, consisting of two 12-pounders, was located near the riverbank. And the officer commanding that battery spotted Salkeld's boat in the darkness. He assumed that it was a Mahratta who was trying to escape from the fort with a part of the treasure. And so he opened fire against his boat, which almost sank as a result. The officer was about to fire again when Salkeld yelled, "Don't fire! It is I! It is Captain Salkeld!" These words were repeated throughout the trenches, and the battery officer received the message just in time, before he would have fired the second shot. It was a close call, but Captain Salkeld was able to arrive at the riverbank unharmed. During the next few days, the British continued their work on the siege battery, and the Mahrattas did everything they could to delay their progress. During the day, the Mahratta gunners on the fort walls would fire grape shot at the trench tops, which meant that the British constantly had to keep their heads down while they were working on their battery. But at night, things were even more dangerous, as Mahratta trench raiding parties would literally crawl towards the edge of the Grand Battery and then open fire at a very close range. As tempting as these targets were for the British gunners, they did not waste the artillery on them, and they made sure to never use anything heavier than musket fire to repulse them. So, during the Battle of Delhi, the British had captured a large number of Mahratta guns, which they afterwards shipped down to Agra via the Jamuna River. These guns were of much better quality than whatever the British had at the time, and Lake now intended to use some of them in the siege of Agra. Finally, in the morning of the 17th of October, the Grand Battery was finished and ready to open fire. It consisted of 8 18-pounders, 4 12-pounders, 6 howitzers, and 6 10-inch mortars. They were also aided by an additional support battery of mortars. The fire was directed against the southeast bastion of the fort, which had been selected for its weakness. There were 2 secondary batteries, one of 4 12-pounders to the left and another of 2 12-pounders to the right of the Grand Battery. And these were used to fire against the Maratha defenders on the fort walls. As massive as the fort of Agra was, it did not stand a chance against the fire from these siege guns. The fire started in the morning, and by the end of the day, the walls of the fort already showed signs of considerable damage. It was clear that if things were to continue like this, it would not take long before a breach was effected. And so it was only a question of time before the fort would fall. The next day, on the 18th of October, the Maratha garrison finally agreed to surrender. This was a wise choice, because if they continued to resist, there would be a lot more casualties on both sides. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Mahrattas now marched out of the fort. They were allowed to take with them their personal possessions, but the treasure and the stores had to be left inside. Scindia's flag was taken down, and the British flag was now raised above this great fort. With the capture of Agra, the British obtained vast quantities of grain, weapons, and war material, including also the amount of 22 lakhs, or 2.2 million rupees, which were actually meant for paying the Maratha garrison, who were months in arrears. According to James Grant Duff, the British had captured as many as 162 pieces of artillery that day. Among the artillery pieces was the so-called Great Gun of Agra, which was huge. The gun itself weighed 96,600 pounds, and the ball of this gun, when it was made out of iron, weighed 15 pounds. And despite its massive size, this gun was fully functional. It was made out of an alloy of 5 different metals, including silver and gold. The Shroffs, or bankers of Agra, offered the British 1 lakh, or 100,000 rupees, for the gun, so that they could melt it down and recover the metal. But Lake instead wanted to take it as a trophy to Calcutta and eventually to England. And so a raft was constructed for the gun to transport it along the river Jamuna. However, the gun turned out to be too heavy for this raft, and as a result, it sank into the riverbed. The gun remained there, buried in the sands, for some years, until it was eventually broken up and recovered. But what was much more valuable than any of this acquired booty was that the possession of Agra gave the British complete control over the Jamuna River, which allowed them to easily move troops and supplies to and from the Doab. And it was this that made the possession of Agra vital for the British conquest of North India.